I am Joy Axelson. This lecture we're going to be looking in Hebrews as Jesus as the high priest. So we'll be looking at Hebrews chapter 4 verse 14 through chapter 5 verse 10 and chapter 7. So let's start out with looking at Jesus as the high priest. Hebrews is an important book in the New Testament because it's the only book that shows Jesus as the high priest and explains how he is and why he is. Now, just to give you some historical background of the original reader's mindset about priests. Priests were very important to them. The Jews saw a huge gap between man and God, and this gap had to be filled. It was a gap because of man's sin, and so there needed to be reconciliation. So this happened in two ways. First, by them obeying the law, and not only that, but the law also revealed to them about God's character and His holy standard. Secondly, there had to be atonement by animal sacrifice. There had to be a payment for their sin. Blood had to be shed. So instead of them being killed, animals were killed. Because God is a just God, so sin has to be dealt with. So let's look at some information about priests. So priests were chosen because back in Exodus 32, the Levites stood with Moses against the sin of when the children of Israel, after Moses was up on the mountain, and they stood with him against the golden calf. So that tribe was chosen to serve. So what were their duties? The Levites, they had a higher level of concentration or of holiness than the rest of Israel. They assisted the priest in help preparing for sacrifices. They took care of the tabernacle. They carried the tabernacle. And when Solomon built the temple, and later on with the temples, they became the doorkeepers and the musicians. So the priests, they had to be from the line of Aaron. They had a higher level of concentration than the Levites. They attended to the duties of the altar, where they dealt with the sacrifices and the blood. They were seen as the mediator from man to God. Then you had the high priest, who was the firstborn of the previous high priests. Of course, Aaron was the first high priest. They had the highest level of consecration or of holiness. They had a big responsibility. Their biggest day was the Day of Atonement. And they were the only ones who could go into the Holy of Holies, of where the Ark of the Covenant was, of God's presence was. And so it was the one day of the year where all the guilt, all the sin of the nation of Israel was forgiven. And it was the only day, as we said, they were allowed to go in the Holy of Holies. And they had to make sure that they were very clean and pure. So this was what the priests and the Levites did. They acted, like we said before, the mediators between God and man. They were man's representative to God. They made atonement for man by making sacrifices. They also prayed, intercede for man. They also taught them the law. And as we said, their office depended on their line of heritage, that they had to come from the line of Aaron, and the oldest son was the high priest. So, they had to follow the law. That was the requirements for these priests. And he had the high priest even had to make a sacrifice for himself and for the sins of the people. This is one of his weaknesses. So the author is now showing the original reader again that they're a critical point. Their experience is leading them to a place similar to where Israel was right before they were supposed to go into Canaan. Now the original reader, they can trust God and obey Him and trust that Jesus is their high priest, that He's dealt everything for salvation. But choosing Jesus can mean humiliation. It could mean martyrdom. And it could be, or they could leave Jesus and disbelieve in Him, turn their back on Him, and have the easier life. So the author now wants to show the original reader why they can trust in Jesus, of how He is a high priest who is merciful and is compassionate to them. Just because Jesus is a heavenly high priest, but He has empathy for them in their weakness and in their struggles. But He is superior because there were many weaknesses in the Levitical high priest. So, let's look at chapter 4 and read verse 14 through 16. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let's hold fast our confidence. Again, that's repeated. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one in whom every respect has been tempted as we, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So this is for most of us, a familiar verse, but it's really important that we understand it from the perspective of the original reader. For them, it was only the high priest that could enter into the presence of God on the Day of Atonement, one day a year. So here the author is giving a picture of Jesus. He didn't enter into the temple that was in Jerusalem, but He entered into the presence, into heaven, into the ultimate presence of God. And the idea in verse 15 of to sympathize is the idea of sharing an experience of carrying both compassion and active help. This is what Jesus does. That Jesus suffers with the one who is being tested, but He brings active help. And that Jesus was tested just like the original reader, just like us. But He did not sin. Temptation is not a sin, but it's how you respond to it. And so He shows that Jesus, He endured testing, but He did not weaken in His faith, and He was always obedient. And through Jesus' high priestly work, through the new covenant, that the original reader have direct access to God whenever, that they have freedom, that they can draw close to Him with confidence and have no fear. And for the original reader, you have to understand, as a Jew, this would be a new concept because only the high priest could go in one day a year into the presence of God on the Day of Atonement. And in the Holy of Holies, there was the Ark of the Covenant, and they had the mercy seat there, and that was a representative of God's presence. And so it seemed like that was the place that God dwelled, even though God, of course, is everywhere. But for them, that represented the ultimate throne of God, the presence of God. And for the original reader, the author shows them, hey, you can go into that Holy of Holies. You can go directly into God because of salvation through Jesus. So why would you want to go back to the old system where the high priest could only go in one day a year? This would be mind-boggling, mind-blowing for them. That the author encourages them, hold fast, draw near to God, that He's there for you to show you mercy in your times of need. So the author goes on in chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, and shows how the high priest is a mediator and was called by God according to the law. But he also shows how Jesus was also called by God. And so in verses 5 through 6, let's read them. So also Christ did not exalt Himself to be made high priest, but was appointed by Him who said, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." So through the author quoting Psalms 2:7, he shows that Jesus didn't try to exalt Himself, but it was God who appointed Him as high priest, that God called Him as His son. So here in these verses, the author connects these two important themes or titles that the author gives to Jesus in this book, or brings out about Jesus in this book, where he is the Son of God and that he's called as the high priest. And so going on in the next verse, in verse 6, and as he says also in another place, quoting from Psalms 110 verse 4, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So this would be again another mind-boggling revelation for the original reader, that the author is connecting those two titles as the Son and the priest. And so to show them that the exalted Son of God was appointed and directly called by God as high priest. Psalms 110 is a messianic psalm and a very important psalm in this book. It was God's promise and oath of a new type of priesthood. You know, the original reader or the Jew would have never thought of another type of priests. They would have thought of the Messiah as a prophet or as a king or teacher, but not as a high priest. Their only concept of priesthood was the Levitical priesthood. But the law did promise another type of priesthood. So let's go on and read chapter 5, verse 7 through 10. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designed by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So verse 7 is a vivid picture of Jesus in his role as high priest, of him praying and acting as a high priest. And verse 8, when it talks about him learning obedience through suffering, Jesus didn't learn obedience like we do. Most of us learn obedience through disobedience because he was always sinless. But it's the idea that through the sufferings, the price that Jesus had to pay was the sufferings. And that was his obedience to the will of God. So his ultimate obedience was that Jesus willingly died. And his priestly duty was to die for our sins. And so the original reader, the author is calling them to be faithful to Christ. Even if it leads them to trials, even if it leads them to suffering. That they need to be challenged, that they also will suffer just as Jesus did. And again in verse 9 through 10, where it talks about being made perfect, salvation, is the idea of Jesus completing the task of salvation. So, now, what are the original reader thinking? Wow, Jesus suffered for them. He paid the ultimate price of death. Through his perfect sacrifice, salvation was made perfect and complete. No more need for sacrifices year after year. So let's turn to chapter 7 now. And now the author explains more here why Jesus is a high priest like Melchizedek. Who is Melchizedek? Well, he is mentioned in Genesis chapter 14, verse 17 through 20. And Abraham had gone to rescue Lot, who had been kidnapped. And so Abraham is on his way back and he meets up with Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a Canaanite king of Salem, which was actually Jerusalem. And as a Canaanite, you would expect him to worship idols, but he worshiped God, and he was appointed as a priest by God. So he blessed Abraham, and Abraham gave him tithes. And then we hear no more about him. Melchizedek, we have no more information about him or what happened to him. And then all of a sudden in Psalms 110 verse 4, we hear once again about Melchizedek, that there is God's promise and God's oath of another type of priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. So why does the author compare Melchizedek and the Levitical priesthood? Well, the thing is that the appointment of the Levitical priest was regulated or controlled by the law of Moses. But Melchizedek didn't have that restrictions, that his type of priesthood was only the fact that he was called by God. He had no other qualifications. It didn't matter where he came from or whatever. It's just he was called by God. The second reason is that the established line of succession of the Levitical priesthood was controlled. It had to be from the line of Aaron. But not true of Melchizedek. His priesthood wasn't passed on to his children and their children's children and children, but it was just because he was called by God. And so this explains why God speaks of a new type of priesthood in Psalms 110, verse 4. A priest who was appointed by God and not by the law of family ties. And it was a permanent priesthood, a priesthood forever. And so this shows how Jesus' priesthood took after was like Melchizedek, that he was appointed by God and that his priesthood was for eternity. So now let's look at Hebrews chapter 7, verse 1 through 3. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. And to him Abraham appointed a tenth of everything. He is first, by some translation of his name, king of righteousness, and he also king of Salem. So actually Melchizedek itself, that word means righteousness and Salem. And he is a king of peace, because Salem means peace. And he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of day nor end of days, but resembles the Son of God. He continues a priest forever. So here Melchizedek is distinguished in the Bible because he's the first priest that is mentioned, priest of the Most High God. He's appointed by God, and his function is, in, of course, talk about Genesis 14, of blessing Abraham, and Abraham then tithed to him. In verse 7, it talks about him being without father and mother, neither beginning of days or ending of days. It's because of these words that people wonder if Melchizedek was a real person or a Christophany. Christophany is an appearance or a non-physical manifestation of Christ. So some people wonder if he was a real person or if he was just Christ coming to visit Abraham at this point. Well, some evidence for it, of course, is this verse. But some evidence against this, saying that Melchizedek actually was a real person, was we have in Hebrews chapter 7 verse 3, where it talks about his type of priesthood is one that represents or resembles the Son of God. Also in Hebrews 6:4, that it was the order, Jesus's high priest was after the order of Melchizedek. And the whole point of the book is that the Old Testament is a type of shadow of the real and superior that came through Jesus in the New Covenant. One way to explain verse 3 could be perhaps that Genesis is just silent about. It doesn't say who his mother and father was. It doesn't say when Melchizedek was born. It doesn't say when he died. And the author doesn't want to bring out that point because he wants to show the main point of using Melchizedek as an illustration is to show that his priesthood didn't depend on who his mother or father was, but it depended on just that he was called by God. The idea in verse 3 where it talks about resembling the Son of God, that he continues to priest for her forever, resembling here only occurs here in the New Testament, and it means a reproduced copy or of model being similar to. So Melchizedek's type of priesthood was just a model or a copy of Jesus' priesthood. That Jesus' priesthood is superior, that it's even the standard, not Melchizedek, but Melchizedek was just an illustration of a higher promised priesthood that came through Jesus. Well, that's something for you to think about and for you to consider yourself and see what you think. Going on in verses 4 through 10, the main point of this is that the author shows that Melchizedek's priesthood is superior to the Levitical priesthood, because in the sense that that Abraham was the representative of all of Israel throughout history, and through him giving the tithe to Melchizedek shows that Melchizedek is superior. Because in that day, the one who was superior would, or greater, would give the blessing, like a father would bless his son. And then those that were inferior would thus give a tithe to the more superior person. So the author is showing that Melchizedek was superior even to Abraham. Going on in verses 11 through 25, the author emphasizes how Jesus was like Melchizedek and not like the Levitical priest, in the sense that the author shows that there is a need for a new type of priesthood that is superior, because the Levitical priesthood was it was inadequate and it was weak, because these priests continuously die and the system just kept going on and on and on and on and never ending. It never dealt with the problem of sin. It just kept sacrifices made for the people and for the priests themselves. So Psalms 110 verse 4 is the prophecy of a new type of priesthood. It shows that the old priesthood was insufficient and inadequate because it could not bring people to perfection. It could not complete the way of salvation, and we see that in verse 11 and 12. Since there had to be a new type of priesthood, there had to be a change in the law, because what did the law say? The law said that priests could only be on the line of Aaron. We see that in verses 11 through 12. And the new type of priesthood could not descend from Levite, because that was a requirement of the old law. And we see that in verse 13 through 14. And Jesus' qualification was not dependent on the fact that he was descended from Aaron, but the power of indestructible life. We see that in verses 15 and 17, where the idea of the resurrection of the dead, because he resurrected from the dead, he had this indestructible life, and that's what the basis of his qualifications are. In verses 18 and 19, the author shows how the Levitical priesthood and the old law had been set aside by a new hope, based on a superior new priest. The old law had a function. The old law defined what sin was, but it was weak. It could not help people to overcome sin. It could not perfect people or make the way complete for salvation. So it was useless, and it had to be set aside. It did not provide a way for man to be able to approach God continuously. Okay, what are the original reader thinking now? Their eyes must be coming out of their head and thinking, oh, now there's not only a new priesthood, but now the old law is not valid anymore. And so going on in verse 23 through 25, the author shows that because Jesus is the eternal final priesthood, that he is the mediator of a new covenant, of an eternal and final salvation. That through Jesus' priestly ministry, he's able to save. All those who are saved are now able to draw close to God through him, and he makes intercession for them. And this is the function of a priest, right? And so going on in verse 26 through 28, it shows that Jesus is the final sacrifice of sin. He's the perfect sacrifice. His own sinlessness explains why no sin offering is now needed. And he put an end to all of the Levitical system of sacrifice once and for all. So now, for the original reader, there's no more law, no more need for Levitical high priest, no more temple, no more sacrifices, no more old covenant. But they can have access through Jesus, their high priest, as their perfect sacrifice. They can have direct access to God now. Thank you.